Can the Jets turn their season around? If we're going to be honest, even after their big win over the Houston Texans, it's going to be very difficult. But there is a narrow path for the Jets to do it, and we'll discuss what that is today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Tuesday, November 5th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, and today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Well, the Jets are 3-6, but they are coming off a big win over the Houston Texans. Getting the season back on track is not going to be easy, even coming off that big win. I do, however, think that there is a pathway for the Jets to turn this season around. I think part of it deals with the schedule. Part of it deals with a player on defense who is improving after a rough start. But we're going to start by talking about the offensive side of the ball, because I do think the game against the Houston Texans showed, if nothing else, the potential promise of this Jets offense moving forward. And I think that if we're going to be honest right now, Aaron Rodgers has not produced at a level that we were hoping for. I think that there was a hope before the start of the season that Rodgers would still, if not play at an MVP level, and that was pretty unrealistic when you consider that he was 40 years old, coming off a serious injury, and had shown some signs of decline in his final Green Bay years. If you weren't expecting that, you were hoping he'd be at least maybe like a top 10 quarterback. And that really hasn't happened. If anything, I think, it would be generous right now at this point to say that Rodgers is a middle of the pack quarterback. To be honest with you, he's probably a below average starting quarterback. And that's still better than what the Jets have gotten in recent years. It's better than what Zach Wilson gave them. It's better than what Sam Darnold gave them. It's better than what Geno Smith gave them. It's better than what Mark Sanchez gave them. There is value in a guy who's at least a credible starting quarterback. And I think at this point, Rodgers is, even if he's below average, he's a guy who understands the reads. He understands how to adjust things pre-snap at the line of scrimmage. When he gets the ball, he needs to make a quick decision. Typically, the ball is going to the right place. And that's something you could not say about many Jets quarterbacks recently, but he has not been a difference maker. And for this Jets offense to work with Rodgers in his current state, he's going to need to be lifted by the guys around him. And if nothing else, that Houston game showed us the formula for the Jets lifting up their quarterback. Rodgers is good enough that if the pieces around him are good, I still think this offense can succeed. And you saw some improved performances. Garrett Wilson, ever since that nightmare game against Pittsburgh, where, of course, the ball should have caught, ended up popping in the air and turned into an interception. He's played 2 big games. And Garrett Wilson's starting to look like Garrett Wilson again. I'll also say Breece Hall is starting to look like Breece Hall again. I think many of us, when the Jets drafted Breece and through those first 2 seasons where the offensive line was struggling to run block, we had dreams of Breece being a top 3, top 5 running back in this league. Well, I think now we can say that that's probably not realistic for Breece, but he can be a big play guy. He can be an asset for this team. And in 3 of his last 4 games, after a really rough start to a season, in 3 of his last 4 games, he's averaged at least 4.9 yards per carry. For the season, he now has his average up to 4 yards per carry. Breece Hall is suddenly starting to look like a player. And I think part of it is that I think Todd Downing is utilizing him on runs that are better suited to his style. They're trying to get him the ball more in space on the outside. You see more sweeps than you did under Nathaniel Hackett. So that's a positive for this team. Another thing, Davante Adams. Now, that's another guy who is not what he used to be. If you're expecting Davante Adams to produce at a 1,500-yard pace, well, I'm just not sure how realistic that is at this point. He's a guy who's 31. He's going to be 32 in December. He's shown over the last 2 years some signs of decline, but he also showed that he can still play in that Thursday night win over the Houston Texans. And look, one thing that Davante Adams brings to the table, he wins off the line of scrimmage as well as anybody. He has maybe the most diverse set of moves to beat press coverage most diverse set of releases at the line of scrimmage, and really kind of a unique guy when it comes to getting releases off the line of scrimmage off press coverage, because a lot of receivers kind of like come up with their plan. They come up with the move they're going to make to beat press coverage before the snap. Adams kind of like decides mid release what he's going to do. There's some technical things he does. Really interesting guy to watch. And if he's not going to be the guy who he was at his athletic peak, and even some of the player tracking data, if you follow it, there's been a decline in his speed level. There's been a decline in his suddenness, but he's still a guy who wins a lot with technique. And even if he's not going to be a 1,500-yard receiver, he's a guy who can be an above-average receiver for this team. Now, does that make it worth a third-round pick? That's a different story. But with this trio of skilled players, you have the tools potentially to get the most you can out of Rodgers. And the other thing I'll say is that it's kind of flown under the radar with the Jets' struggles, and maybe not so much in run blocking, but this offensive line has actually been pretty decent. If you watch the way this team has blocked, now difficult because they've been missing, a couple of guards or dealing with injuries, so you don't know what you're going to get going forward if you're rolling with Max Mitchell and Olu Fashanu. But the Jets have actually done a pretty decent job on the offensive line, which is not something we could say much in recent years. If you look at what they've got this year versus what they had last year, it's kind of night and day. And even two guys, I've been critical of the two tackles they've had, Tyron Smith and Morgan Moses, and Smith more so than Moses. But Tyron Smith, even though I think he's playing at the level of a below average starter at the left tackle position, and while that is disappointing, while we had much higher expectations for him, Tyron Smith for much of his career has been an elite left tackle. And when the Jets signed him, like many of you, I was hoping that he would be a difference maker, because if you get elite left tackle play, that's the type of thing that just has a multiplier effect across your offensive line. It's the type of thing that makes your offensive line, makes everybody better on that line. Tyron Smith has not been that guy. That said, even with his struggles this year, even though he's, I would say, a below average starting left tackle, he's still a big upgrade over what the Jets had at that position. And I think that a below average starting left tackle still has value in this league, because left tackle is a position where if you have a below average starter, you can survive. You can't survive with a guy who's unplayable. And for many of the last few seasons, the Jets have had unplayable guys at the left tackle position, especially when they've had guys go down. And if you look across the rest of the line, I mean, I think, John Simpson, who, we'll see what happens with him health-wise, that actually turned into a pretty decent signing. I think he'd been erratic early in the season, but he's started to come on. The Jets' interior offensive line, Joe Tippmann, who's been up and down, starting to come on. Elijah Vera Tucker's been solid through much of the season. And with Rodgers' mobility reduced, the offensive line play becomes much more important, because Rodgers really can't move much at this point. And that, I think that was true even before he was injured. I mean, I know he got a lot of praise for his movement skills pre-injury, but if you watched him versus what he was in Green Bay, that's kind of night and day. And for Rodgers to be able to thrive, for Rodgers to be able to have any sort of success, he's going to need to lean on his offensive line, because you can tell the hits have already begun adding up, and we just passed the halfway point of the season. At 40 years old, it's much tougher to recover than it was in the past, back when he was in his prime. So part of the way Rodgers has tried to mitigate this is he's just tried to get the ball out quickly. Well, in that Thursday night game, he held on to the ball a little bit longer at points. And I think the pass protection was very good. And if the Jets are going to win going forward, look, Aaron Rodgers, I don't think can lift this team on his back on a consistent basis. I do think there's a game here or there where he can play really well, but that Thursday night game against Houston was a good example. Awful first half, only 32 passing yards through that first half. But in the second half, his numbers were fantastic. I don't know that he played that as well as his numbers would suggest. I think he got lifted up, as particularly that phenomenal catch Garrett Wilson made. But I think both of the touchdown passes, Garrett Wilson made really nice plays on them. Rodgers is good enough that I still think he's got enough in the tank, and I think he's clearly in decline, but he's got enough in the tank that if you put really good pieces around him, you can at least have a lot of success. And that's what the Jets will need to lean on going forward. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the defensive side of the ball. There's a player who got off to a slow start there, who I think has really picked up his game, and that could make all the difference in the world for this defense. We'll talk about who that player is and why it can make such a difference as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Our episode today of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is the best place to get last-minute tickets to your favorite events, and Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets to see your favorite teams play even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Maybe after that win against Houston, you're a little bit more optimistic about the Jets. Maybe you want to find good Jets tickets. Game Time is the place to go to get in on the action. I've used Game Time many times myself. I can't believe the deals I've gotten last a couple hours before my event. I opened up the app and found amazing deals. My favorite part, though, is that you see the view from your seat. That you have a picture of what it's going to look like after you arrive. So no surprises, no obstructed views. Game Time's the place to go. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time Picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL, one word with no space, for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is also brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Checking out the line. Jets on the road in Arizona this coming Sunday. 1.5-point road underdog. So you're getting some points with the Jets. Again, $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you every day. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. We're talking about today how the Jets can get this season back on track. And I'm not going to lie to you. It's not going to be easy. It's probably going to take 9-8 to make the playoffs in the AFC. And that's an adjustment. I've been saying for weeks that I thought it would be 10-7. But if you look at the way the AFC is shaking out, if you look at some of the numbers, probably more realistically 9-8. The problem is that the Jets are 3-6, which means it's going to take 6-2 over the last 8. Jets will have to play 750 ball. I'm going to be honest with you. It's going to be really tough for this team. This team has put itself in a very difficult position, but there is a narrow path. If anything, it may not be a likely path. In fact, if you look at a lot of the odds makers, or if you look at like a lot of the analytical websites, ESPN's analytics give the Jets about a 20% chance of making the playoffs. The Athletic gives the Jets a 17% chance. So I think it's probably in that 1-5, 1-6 range. Most of the analytics sites seem to think, which is not great, but at least there is an outside possibility. And we're talking about the ways the Jets can get there. And I think on the defensive side of the ball, I know the unit itself statistically looks pretty good this year. I think if you've watched this unit, there have been struggles, but there is one thing that makes me really optimistic about this unit. And normally in football in the NFL, one player only matters so much, but I do think there's one player who got off to a really slow start this season who started to pick things up, and that's the type of thing that can have a multiplier effect on the defense. And that player is Quinnen Williams. And if you listen to the show the first few weeks of the season, I kind of dismissed Quinnen's struggles. And then we got to week 5, week 6. He still wasn't producing. I started to get worried. The good news is that the last 3 weeks or so, Quinnen has started to come on. He had a very solid first half in Pittsburgh on Sunday Night Football. Then against the Patriots offensive line that really should have been hopeless for most of the game and was hopeless against him. He was constantly in the backfield. And then against the Houston Texans, I thought he had his best game of the season. And I thought, as crazy as this is to say, because the NFL is not an individual sport, it's a team sport. And it's not just a team sport. It's a team sport where you have 11 guys on offense, 11 guys on defense. And nobody plays both ways. So 22 players take the field at any given point, or 22 guys are starters. It's not like basketball where one player plays the whole game and you only have 5 at the court at one time. Basketball, it's easy for one player to take over the game. I don't think it's as easy as football. It's as easy in football. And Quinnen Williams, I thought, took that game over, and he kept the Jets in the game. Whenever the Jets were in trouble in that first half, and the Houston Texans had a number of opportunities to take this game over, Quinnen Williams made a big play, whether it was the strip sack of C.J. Stroud when the Texans were nearing scoring range, multiple sacks, constantly disrupting, multiple quarterback hits. Quinnen Williams was responsible for the Jets having a chance to win this game, only being down 7 heading to the locker room. And he's the type of guy who makes everybody around him better because he draws so much attention. And I think that when you have great players in this league, it's easy to like maybe overstate their impact. I hear a lot of times, oh, well, this guy's drawing double teams, and it's not always true. Defensive tackle is a spot where you obviously draw a lot of double teams because you're facing the interior of the other team's offensive line. But it's more than drawing double teams. It just he forces you to put so much attention on him that it just makes life easier on everybody else. And even when you double team him, he's so technically sound that he can get to the quarterback. He can get into the backfield. He can shed blocks. He can bring down runners in the backfield for tackles for losses. He makes a huge difference. And with Sauce Gardner, frankly, not having a very good season, Quinnen becomes even more important. Now, I love Sauce. I think Sauce will bounce back. We can have theories. We can discuss theories on what's wrong with Sauce right now, and there are a couple things that come to mind. Sauce Gardner's not playing like Sauce Gardner. And Quinnen Williams, through the first 6-7 weeks of the season, was not playing like Quinnen Williams. If Sauce Gardner starts playing like Sauce Gardner, it's going to change the Jets defense. When Quinnen Williams starts playing like Quinnen Williams, it does change the Jets defense. And it has. And it did in that game against the Houston Texans because Quinnen Williams makes all the pass rushers around him better. Quinnen Williams can help slow down a run game. And, I don't know how well he did that against Houston, but he can. And Quinnen Williams, when your corners are struggling, makes their life easier because when you have a pass rush, when you have guys who can get to the quarterback, it puts less emphasis on the corner position. You can live with Sauce Gardner maybe struggling. Look, we want to see Sauce pick it up. But Quinnen Williams' emergence over the last 2-3 weeks has been a big story. And if the Jets are going to keep winning games, if the Jets are going to keep playing well on the defensive side of the ball, and by well, I mean not just okay. I mean the type of dominant defense we were looking for. Quinnen Williams has to keep playing like this. There are not many defensive tackles in this league who can take a game over the way Quinnen Williams does. And through the first handful of weeks of this season, he really had not shown that. In fact, if anything, he was having a bad season. I think through the first 5-6 weeks, he was a below average defensive tackle. I mean, if you watch some of those reps he had, especially in the run game, I mean, there were too many times where he was just getting completely wiped out of plays. He was a below average defensive tackle the first 5-6 weeks. Last 3, though, he started to turn it on. He started to look like the Quinnen Williams of old. And that's a big thing for the Jets. And any pathway for the New York Jets to turn this season around, it requires Quinnen Williams to play like a Pro Bowler, if not an All-Pro, because he's the one guy on the defense. And there are not many of these guys in the NFL who can take an average defense and make it good, or take a good defense and make it great. He's got that type of ability. And part of it's just he's so technically sound that, he doesn't just try and win on athleticism. He tries to win on technique. And that's the type of thing that's just repeatable on a week-to-week basis because everybody's big, everybody's strong. The guys who are great in the league are very physically gifted, but they also know how to fight with their hands. They know how to put on pass rush moves. They know how to have a counter if their first move is stopped. Those are the things Quinnen Williams brings to the table. And while, yes, the Jets defense as a whole needs to play well, he's the one guy. He's just so talented that he can escalate it. He can take that defense to the next level. That had you on the Locked On Jets podcast. We'll talk about one last thing that could benefit the Jets going forward. Look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you their schedule is easy. I think anybody saying that isn't paying attention to the teams that are on the horizon. But I think there's no doubt the Jets have faced a tough schedule in the early part of the season, and that's been a surprise. It does get a little bit easier for here, which could be fortuitous for this team, and we'll discuss how and why as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. This month is all about gratitude, and sometimes we don't thank ourselves enough. It's sometimes hard to remind ourselves that we are trying our best to make sense of everything, and in this crazy world, that's not easy. Here's a reminder to send some thanks to the people in your life, including yourself. Therapy has a lot of benefits. It's helpful for learning positive coping skills and how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself, and it's not just for those who have experienced major trauma. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Let the gratitude flow with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday. We're talking about how the Jets at 3-6 can get this season back on track. Now, one of the things I always say each spring when the schedule comes out is schedule release day is one of the most overrated days on the NFL calendar, if not the most overrated day on the NFL calendar. And the reason I say that is we have these perceptions of which teams are going to be good and which teams are going to be bad. We have these perceptions of which games are going to be easy and which games are going to be hard. And most of the time, it's based on last year's standings. And there's a lot of difference between this year's standings and last year's standings. There are always teams that were good last year who aren't as good this year. There are always surprise teams, in both directions. If you look at the early part of this Jets schedule, I think a lot of us thought it would be pretty easy for this team. Now, some of those have panned out. Tennessee has been, pretty bad. 2 games against New England in the early part of the schedule. Jets only won one of those 2, but the Patriots are one of the worst teams in the NFL. But the Jets have also, they've faced a lot of tough opponents. I mean, they've faced 3 of the 4 current division leaders in the AFC, the Buffalo Bills, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and the Houston Texans. They also face a Denver team that, is 5-4 right now. Now, coming off a pretty bad loss to Baltimore, but a team that surprised us. They also faced Minnesota, a Vikings team that's 6-2, a Vikings team that's surprising us. Now, I don't think that the rest of the schedule is necessarily easy for the Jets. They have 2 games against the Miami Dolphins. And while the Dolphins right now are a 2-6 football team themselves, I think any objective observer would acknowledge that with Tua Tagovailoa back in the lineup and he's missed a number of games, it's a different football team. It's a team that swept the Jets last year and won both games pretty handily. But it is a team that's 2-6. It's a team that, may not have a lot to play for. The Jets at 2-6, the Jets at 3-6 are on the fringes of being outside the race. So are the Dolphins. And if another loss or 2 along the way, the Dolphins could be, just playing for pride or playing for draft positioning. You wonder what you'll get when you face them. You look at the rest of the Jets schedule. Okay, this weekend they actually do play another division leader in Arizona, but that's a division leader that's only 5-4. I don't think they're quite on the level of some of the other division leaders the Jets have faced so far this season. They have a couple other games against NFC West competition. The 4-4 Rams, who are playing better, that may be a tougher game than we thought it would be a few weeks ago, but the Rams ultimately are a 4-4 football team. They have been outscored by 24 points this season, so they have a worse point differential than the Jets at this point. Jets also face the Seattle Seahawks at 4-5. Not an easy opponent, but an opponent that is kind of moving in the wrong direction. They've lost 2 games in a row. They're not playing as well as they were early in the season. A winnable game for the Jets potentially. Jets. There are some winnable games ahead for the Jets. So the Colts are 4-5 right now. They're kind of a team in turmoil. Jets do have to go up to Orchard Park to play the Bills, so that'll be a tough game. But the bottom line is that while the rest of the schedule is not that easy for the Jets, it does appear at least more favorable than the early part of their schedule was. And again, that's a surprise. I think most of us, when schedule release day came in the spring, shortly after the draft, we thought that the easy part of the schedule would be the early going, and maybe it'd be a little bit tougher in the last half of the schedule. Another thing the Jets do have going for them is they have their bye coming up in a couple of weeks, and there are lots of different schools of thought on the bye. If you're a longtime listener, you know that I think generally speaking, getting your bye as late as possible is a good thing. And some of it comes down to luck. There are teams, I remember back in 2015, the Jets had a very early bye. That was a year where they had a London game in the early part of their schedule, and they decided to take the bye right after the London game. And it ended up working out really well because they had some guys who were banged up at that point. Chris Ivory was banged up. Eric Decker was banged up. So for that Jets team, an early bye was actually good fortune. But I think for most teams, and especially for a veteran team like the Jets, especially for a veteran team that has guys banged up like the quarterback who's clearly playing through some stuff right now, as late of a bye as possible is good because it gives the guys a chance to heal up. It gives the guys a chance to get fresher, gives guys a chance to get as healthy as possible. November, December, nobody's really healthy. Even 1 week off is not going to fix that entirely, but it gives them a chance to get at least as healthy as possible and healthier than a lot of your opponents for the stretch run. So I think that, in some ways the schedule makers did not do the Jets a lot of favors this year. And look, we know the 17 teams that the Jets play is not who the league assigns them. It's based on the formulas the league has for determining opponents. But it does feel like things will lighten up a little bit here going forward. And, the results of the games going forward could also, work in the Jets' favor. If some of these teams they're facing kind of fall out of the playoff race and the Jets got a little bit of a roll, you wonder what versions of those teams you'll face. If teams fall out of the playoff race, are they going to come out with the same intensity? Will they, if they fall behind early in the game, will they show the same level of fight? That's something you see from time to time in the NFL. If a team does not get off, if a team's kind of out of the race, nobody ever, very rarely you see a team go out and actively quit, but you'll see, sometimes they fall behind and they kind of get dispirited. And that's the type of thing that could benefit the Jets. Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. The Jets have a tough path forward. And I spoke yesterday on the show about why I felt like the Jets should be sellers at the trade deadline. But I wanted to give you the alternative perspective today because, even though I'm not really a believer that the Jets turning this around is terribly realistic, there is at least a narrow path. And I'm trying, like most of you, I'm just trying to figure out a way for this Jets season to end in success and not end in disappointment. It certainly looks like we're heading in the direction of ending in disappointment, but that when it gets Houston, at least gives you some sort of hope, no matter how faint it is, that maybe, possibly, somehow this thing can turn around. Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts, but that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show or are listening on the podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Tuesday. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.